Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Bible study. I'd like to start again by apologising for not being able to be with you in person. I'm representing the conference at the Methodist Church in Sri Lanka. That wasn't planned 18 months ago when I said, yes, I would do these Bible studies. But seeing as we would in any case be online, the fact that I'm online in leading this Bible study kind of doesn't really seem to make that much of a difference. I hope that's all right. I'd like also to say that doing these stories, one of the things that I really like to do when I'm looking at Bible stories is that I like to use these little wooden figures. They are, it's a bit like godly play. I'm not godly play trained, but I find it really helpful to step the story out, to ask those questions like, who is in this space first? Where are all the people in this space? Who is together in this space? How are the people separate in this space? Are there outsiders in this space? Are the people oppositional in this space? How does that work? It's very unlikely that you've got little wooden people, but you might have a button box or something with tokens in it that you could use if you wanted to represent the stories in that way. But I shall use them when I talk about them. And in these stories, I'll try and talk and screen share at the same time. In these stories, we are looking at stories not so much about water, but stories in which the place where water is to be found is an important motif. Stories about wells or rivers or cisterns or springs, all those sorts of places, and the life which goes on around them. The psalm says, deep calls unto deep in matters of religion. And I'm always interested to know whether in looking at these stories, we can explore more deeply. And in some of these very ancient texts, find something in which deep parts of ourselves are touched deeply by what we read. Today, I want us to look at the ideas of bitterness and grace that we find in two important stories, both of which are at wells. Sometimes we are called to places which are more difficult than we might expect or we had any right to expect. And sometimes grace surprises us when we least expect it. But I'd like to begin not by leaping into the Bible study, but first by looking at this picture by Maggie Hambling. It's in the Methodist collection of modern religious art, one of the world's treasures, which the British Methodist Church is the custodian. This is a picture called Good Friday Walking on the Water 2006. It's called 2006 because I understand that Maggie Hambling paints a different picture of, I think, walking on the water, certainly a walking watery thing or a Good Friday thing every year. And this is her 2006 Walking on the Water. And I understand that for her, it's something to do with the turmoil that she experienced around the death of her mother and some of a way that she has of commemorating that. For me, this is a picture that speaks a lot about water. I love the sea, but I find it really quite terrifying. When I stand on the edge of a boat or a ferry, even just going between two islands that aren't that far apart, and I look down at the water churning and the currents, I really feel quite anxious about it. And this picture then reflects some of that churning and turmoil and symbolises places where my life has sometimes been. If we look at the bottom part of the picture and we see the water being stirred up, or we look at the top left of the picture and the sea on the horizon, and it just goes on. There's so much of it, and it's so deep and so churning. And when I've been in a very difficult place, I have felt as though that sea expresses where I am, bobbing about, not really in full control over what's happening to me, over my experiences, being pulled by deep currents into places that are full of dread. And yet at the same time, having that feeling that although all of that is very real, somehow the darkness is overprinted with a light that will not let me go. Here we see the light on the top of the water. And is it my imagination? Or is it somehow falling in a cross shape, that cross of light imprints the water of my darkness? And on the top of it, we have that figure. It's called walking on water, so I take this to be a reference to the stories of Jesus walking on the water. And I take the light as being something that comes from him. But the figure, is it walking towards us? Or is it going away from us? Is the figure saying, it's all right, I'm here, I'm coming? Or is the figure saying, it's all right, follow the path of light and you'll stick with me? I don't know. I don't know that Maggie Hambling knows. But I do know that this picture means a huge amount to me. And it resonates with our water theme. So today we're going to look at two passages, and the first of those is in Exodus chapter 15. It's a story of events at a well. It comes immediately as the Hebrew people have escaped from slavery in Egypt. You will remember the story. After the Joseph business, the descendants of Joseph and his brothers and his family end up settling in Egypt, where a new pharaoh comes and creates them into slavery. And then another pharaoh comes and makes their slavery even more arduous. And Moses is brought up through that slavery period and grows up as a leader of the people. He has confronted Pharaoh with his "let my people go" message, and 9 plagues have happened which have not convinced Pharaoh. And on the 10th plague, Pharaoh changes his mind. He lets the people go and then changes his mind again, pursues them with his army. The army are defeated as the waters of the Red Sea curve over them, and the Hebrew people are safe on the other shore. So they've just gone into this new period of freedom and wonderfulness, and all the badness is behind them. And they've done what God told them to do with what they could carry, and putting the mark on their doorpost and everything. And they have their first taste of salvation. So we're going to read from verse 19 because it just sets the context of the story. So we're in Exodus 15:19. When the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and his chariot drivers went into the sea, the Lord brought back the waters of the sea upon them. But the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. Then the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." Then Moses ordered Israel to set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness, but found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. That's why it was called Marah. And the people complained against Moses, saying, "Well, what are we going to drink?" He cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he put them to the test. He said, "If you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give heed to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will not bring upon you any of the diseases that I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." And then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. And they camped there by the water. If we look at that story with our little people, difficult to do on screen, but if we look at that story, we have a cluster of people, and the people are murmuring, and murmuring is one of the motifs of the Exodus stories. Throughout the desert wanderings, there's a huge amount of this murmuring goes on. The people are not happy. But we can understand the people being not happy. They're being led by Moses, and they have been out for 3 days, and they must be desperately thirsty. And they come to the place that God has led them to, that Moses has led them to, and it's God leading Moses, surely. And they find that there is water there, but it is foul and bitter. So not only do they go from not having any water, which is bad enough, but they come to a place where there's water, but not a drop to drink. And it's in that place of darkness and despair and much murmuring, that God engages with them and shows them a way in which they can encounter God as the God who heals. If we had our people and we were working on one surface, where would we put Moses in relation to the people? You have to feel quite sorry for Moses here. In fact, throughout the Exodus stories, you feel quite sorry for Moses. He is consistently brushing up against the people's murmuring. He is a leader whom people want to follow, but are perpetually dissatisfied with. So Moses stands apart. How is he different from the people? What is it that distinguishes him? He is equally challenged by the bitterness of the water. And some people would say he is the one who goes to God, and these are the people who simply stand and murmur. I don't know. That's an image worth thinking about. Our second story is also a story about a well. It's a story found in John chapter 5, and starting at the beginning of the chapter. After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, Now in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool called in Hebrew Bethesda, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been lying there for a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Well, stand up, take up your mat and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. That day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been cured, "It's the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to carry your mat." But he answered him, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your mat and walk'?" Now, the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared. Let's just get rid of that. For Jesus had disappeared in the crowd that was there. And later, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, You've been made well. Do not sin any more, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. And therefore, the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. If we had a surface in our midst on which we could lay out little wooden people, this becomes a very interesting picture, I think. We have lots of people with need, and only one of them to whom Jesus goes. Out of this group, for no reason that we can understand or that he can understand, one person's needs are attended to. That person has been there for a very long time. He is at the well for 38 years and he can't get down to the healing waters because when the waters do their magic thing, he is not capable of that movement and other people get there ahead of him. That might be why Jesus picks this one out. But despite the fact that he's been there for 30 odd years, and despite the fact that Jesus is able to do this, what he says to the man is, "Do you want to be made well? What is it that you want to happen here? In your difficult situation, what do you want to happen? What is, if you could control your own fate here, what is it that you would want?" An interesting question. But besides the man, these are the people lying by the pool, besides the man and Jesus, there are also the people in opposition. And the man vacillates, doesn't he, between the two? Because when the opposition say, "Who was it who did this? You shouldn't be doing this," he dobs Jesus in it. He doesn't avoid them. He doesn't run away. He doesn't go and hide. He stays there and he leads Jesus into more difficulty. So the place where he encounters grace also becomes a place of betrayal. Why does he do that? Why does that happen? If we looked at our little people spread out, it's interesting to ask what might be their motivations. I have a favourite cartoon that I saw many years ago, almost 40 years ago. It's drawn by somebody called Peter de Milo, who I think was somebody who trained as a Catholic priest but left the priesthood. And his cartoons featured little beanie people. I don't think we called them beanies in those days. Beanies hadn't been, clip art hadn't really been invented. But he had little people in his cartoons. And in this cartoon, there was a huge white space and then lots of little footprints going round in all sorts of chaotic directions on the page. It was a bit like a pastiche of footprints in the sand. And the caption of the cartoon, the little person was standing there looking up at heaven. And the caption said, "If you took the time to notice God, you could see that I am trying to follow." Sometimes that's our experience, I think. We are really, really trying and we make prayerful choices and we try to act for the best, or we prepare for the best, or we have every reason to hope for the best, and things turn very sour and go horribly wrong on us. I went through a very dark period in my life, about 10 years ago. And the thing was that the reason I had got into that place was because I had prayed and considered my vocation and had had followed through on what I believed God was, where God was leading me to be. And when I first entered that place, and I'm being quite coy about it because, this is the internet. When I first entered that place, I was saying to a group of friends, I really did not think that this was what God wanted for me. And yet, after much prayer, this is the opening that came. And somebody who wasn't really part of the conversation, but was a very religious person, from outside our conversation, just said, he doesn't make mistakes. Now, she has an interesting theology all of her own. But the fact that this voice came in from the outside somehow stayed with me. This, even though this wasn't what I'd expected, it was actually the place where God called me to be. It was difficult from the get-go, and over a period of several years, it became more and more difficult. So although I believed that God had called me to it, and although I believed that in difficult decisions and difficult actions and many, many challenges, that I was doing the work, or trying to do the work of God in that place, I was standing for justice and righteousness and protecting the weak, and interrupting bad things happening, etc., etc. It turned out to be a really bitter thing. It was followed by salvation. When things were very dark, I texted a friend and sent a very short message. It's a friend that I don't very often talk to. I sent a very short message saying things are just dreadful. And they sent me a text that said, have you seen this job? And it was the job of Director of Education in the Connectional team. And there were 19 pages of application form, and I didn't get to fill it all in because I was dealing with everything else. And then about a month later, things were even more difficult. And I texted the friend again and I said, very simply, I think I just said, it's even worse now. And the friend texted me back and said, have you seen that they've re-advertised? And I applied and I got the job, and that was a complete change of life for me. So most unexpected change. It took me out of my former professional world into a completely different professional world. It was, I was at an age where, certainly when I was a young professional, people thought they would probably retire at that age. I had many friends who did. And yet here I was embarking on a new career and new challenges and different things to do. And it became fabulous. But at the time, it was bitter and horrid and very destructive of me. In the plagues, Moses said that he wanted to take the people 3 days into the desert to worship. So here they are, 3 days in, and this is what they find instead. 3 days without water, and they would be desperate. The wilderness is, to start with, not a very comfortable place to be. And in this uncomfortable place, when help appears to be there, the water, that actually turns out to be very challenging too. And although it doesn't say that God has led them to this place, we know from chapter 13 that God is leading them day and night with the fiery and the cloudy pillars. So somehow it seems in this story that this is not just another fine mess that they've got themselves into, but that somehow faith or following has somehow got them here. And they're not just sad about the thing happening in their lives. They can't help feeling betrayed by God. When they call the well bitter, they mean both that the water is bitter tasting, but also that the experience makes them feel bitter. There's a lot of murmuring, and this is a motif throughout these desert stories, God's people following, but doubting, and not altogether happy at the same time. I rather love the fact, actually, that in this Bible narrative, the scriptures which we treasure, there is a story about bitterness. And I love the fact, actually, that it comes at this point. This is a story which is entirely about salvation. Miriam has taken her tambourine and the other women have got their tambourines and they're happy as sandboys. And at this point, there is a place for a well of bitterness. It's not only there, it comes out in the Psalms particularly, of course. It might be that you in your own lives have managed to swerve the well of bitterness. Maybe the well of bitterness has not been part of the topology of your journey. Maybe you've seen the well of bitterness, but you've not been drawn to stop there. Maybe you've come there and I meet you there, but you've come by a different route. I have a friend who, if he were here, would rue that he had given a life of service, working hard for the kingdom. And then at the point of a well-deserved retirement, looking towards skipping off into the sunset with his lovely wife, she was diagnosed with a very aggressive cancer and died. And he's not alone, and I'm not alone. If we linger at the well of bitterness, we'll hear a lot of other stories. Some people will have been there a long time. Some people will define their lives by a choice never to leave, lest the world forget the wrong that was done. Maybe that's why Jesus frequently asks the people he heals what it is that they want. In this Bible narrative, what we see is that the experience of the well at Marah does not end there. In this situation, God speaks. I am the God who heals you. And is this actually the first definition of the qualities of I am? Moses has met God at the burning bush earlier in this book. And that is the beginning of the Hebrew salvation narrative. And is this actually the first time that I am begins to be unpacked? Who are you? Well, I am the God who heals you. Those of you who have stood at the well at Marah, those of us who have stood there, will know that speaking about healing isn't easy. How we move on in the journey isn't easy. For me to say, here are these people experiencing great bitterness, but don't worry, the Lord is the Lord who heals. But when we are in the wilderness, how do we actually encounter the God who heals, the God who makes us whole? These are hard questions with no easy answers. If you read upon this story, you will find answers given. Things that are probably true in the commentaries, but that you really can't just trip off your tongue too easily. And in a pastoral setting where people are at the well of bitterness to say, oh, don't worry, God will come along and heal you in a minute. There'll be a big piece of wood. That'll do the trick. These are difficult lines to use helpfully. Some of the commentaries say, well, the difference between Moses and the people is that he believes that the situation can be changed by God, who has already done so much for them. I think that's a difficult thing to hold when you are in those darkest of places. Some of the commentaries say it's only when you really experience the desolation of the wilderness that you really experience God's healing. Dostoevsky, I think, has something to say about that. Something like, the price of the pain is not worth the joy of the healing. And I think Dostoevsky has quite a bit going for him. And what is this wood that heals? Tradition says that it is a foreshadowing of the cross of salvation. 2 Peter 2:24 says, "For he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed." Well, I can buy that on the seismic and cosmic level of God's work in Christ for the world. But it's something that I find difficult to key into at that personal and everyday level when things are really difficult. However it works, and however it works for you, and even if it's still what you are waiting for rather than what you experience, these words leap off the page. I am the Lord who heals you. I am the one who makes you whole. It happened for me in a generous and outside all expectations sort of way. Like the Hebrew people, I have moved on. But like the Hebrew people, it is still there in my story. I am healed, but maybe scarred, at least in my memory. I pray that the God who makes things whole will also break through the place of bitterness for you, if that's what you need. But at the time as it was happening, something else happened. When I was at this lowest point in my life, absolutely desperate, I went with my daughter, who doesn't believe what I believe, to see the arena production of Jesus Christ Superstar. It was the big arena tour. It had Tim Minchin in it and a Spice Girl in it. And she enjoyed it. My daughter enjoyed it hugely. And I sat and wept from start to finish. And I realise this sounds preposterous and maybe arrogant, but I'm just going to tell you how I felt. As I watched what was happening in the Jesus Christ Superstar story, the last week of the life of Jesus, as I watched everything that was happening, I felt it resonated with everything that was happening to me. Everything that was happening to me had happened to Jesus first. Betrayal, abandonment, falsehood, powerless rightness in the face of powerful wrongness and pragmatic hand-washing. It was all there. And like Jesus, most bewilderingly, the sense that God had got me into this, so why wasn't God getting me out of it? And although it didn't stop that lowest point, being very low indeed, and although I couldn't see how it could ever come right again, I felt like the disciples on the lake in the storm with Jesus, that this was not the end of my discipleship story. And in fact, it wasn't. I believed that I was saved. And I know that that doesn't happen for everyone, and I don't know why it happened to me. And yet with Job, when everything had gone into hell in a handcart, I was still able to say that you are the God who is above the darkness and whose imprint is on the darkness of my water. If we move to the story of the paralyzed man at Bethesda, then interestingly also here we have this crowd of people. This pool is not called Place of Bitterness. It's called House of Mercy. That's what Bethesda means, Bet meaning house, House of Mercy. Here, people come to receive grace, but it's not very accessible. It's rationed to the first to get there. And the people trying to get there are not actually the best able to get it. I think there's a message for our mission as a church there. And this here is a man who really struggles. He is physically weak and he is without family and friends. He doesn't have people around him who can bring the grace closer or bring him closer to the grace. He is in a place of separation from the grace, and he's been there for a long time because he has nobody to help him. Interestingly, this is the story about the well as a place of rule breaking. The passage says that the well is set in an area with 5 porticos, 5 big gates. And these 5 porticos are thought to represent the 5 books of the Torah, the Jewish law, the kernel of God's covenant with his people. And that makes it an interesting counterpoint to the story of Mara, because in the story at Mara, God says, I am the God who heals you, and you will find that out if you follow in obedience to me. I'm making a covenant with you. This is my way that I want you to follow. You stick with that, and you will find that I am the healing God. But here, healing is not part of the keeping the rules relationship. Here, there is obedience, and there is relationship and even covenant. Jesus says to him, stop sinning. But the rules of the Torah, much to the anger of the Sabbath police in the temple, the rules of Torah of the Mosaic covenant, so important in the Mara story, are set aside here. And of course, that story, of course, in this story, then, Jesus gets into trouble with the Sabbath police. That's not how we do things here brigade. Here is a guy in a place where healing is offered, and he can't get to the healing, and then he gets healed, and people are glad for him. No, the people are really cross because it happened on the Sabbath, and we don't do that sort of thing here on this day. What's the balance between acting authentically and being an annoying new person? Some months ago, a year and some months ago, we had the induction service for our new district chair. He came from somewhere else, and we had a big service, and there was a group of people commissioned to play for the service, and we sang some hymns that maybe we haven't conventionally sung here in that sort of service. And one of them was the hymn about being lifted up like eagles. You are the everlasting God. And it was being played very slowly. And the visiting preacher, whom I won't name, used to singing these things perhaps at a more jolly pace and with a bit of a groove behind them, started a bit of clapping going, all on their own, but you are the everlasting, etc., etc. At the end of the service, I was talking to the person who'd been in charge of the music, and they said to me, somebody was clapping. Don't they know we don't do that in Devon? I don't think that's even correct. But this is Devon. We don't do that here. We are Methodists. We don't do that here. Or we are whatever. We don't do that here. What are those things which are part of that balance between acting authentically and breaking through that because it's getting in the way of the access to grace? And what are we to make of the mention in this story that the well is only effective when it's stirred up? Sometimes preachers use a slogan that it's their job to comfort the disturbed, and to disturb the comfortable. Do you go to church to be comforted or to be disturbed? And what happens if you go to be comforted, but the preacher is in a I'm going to disturb you mode? Or what happens if the other operates? Sometimes I think they actually mean, I want to challenge people to be like me. How does that work in your setting? The well is also a place, this well is also a place where words, grace and betrayal can be used. Although we might say that the boot is on the other foot. In the Old Testament story, betrayal, that disappointment and murmuring, and that is met with admonishment, but also with grace. And that's pretty well the story of the Old Testament. The people murmur, and yet they are met endlessly with grace. Here, the man is met with grace. He has received extraordinary grace. And yet his response to that is that he dobs Jesus in it. So Here are some things which you might like to discuss. All of this talking is by invitation, but I invite you to look at the story of the well of bitterness and the difficult to get to healing pool. Do these stories resonate with you? Talk about the questions these stories raise for you, and if you feel comfortable, share your own stories from the well, wells you have lingered at or wells you have swerved on your journey. I am the God who heals you. The early Methodists were encouraged to talk about their experience of God's saving presence. When you think about your story of salvation, what language helps you to express that? How do you make that intelligible to other people? People outside that, people at a distance from that well of grace and healing. Are there barriers to finding grace in any of the religious settings with which you are familiar? Imagine them from an outsider point of view. What might need to change to make the heart of our faith more accessible? Is church for you a place of trouble or a place of peace? Which do you think it should be? The Bible frequently uses the language of disability as a metaphor for spiritual shortcomings. How does this strike you here? What other ways of speaking might there be if we are talking in these stories? Thank you for being with me, and thank you for your time. Bye.